really upset, CG do even more upset. What are we going to do? Well, what I'm going to do is spin this incredibly well. Broadly speaking, I think what we've all, for one thing, all the teams have agreed on, and what this debate is about, is what is a legitimate means, both in the sense that it's principally acceptable and efficacious to maximize social justice in any given type of state. So eventually this debate just became about Syria under the status quo and the United States, presumably, and countries like India. We think it kind of applies everywhere. The first thing I'm going to be analyzing is how the government bench has either misanalyzed or not responded to Chris's analysis of how social injustice and how social justice actually works. So we're happy to concede, perhaps, that the Kurds in Turkey suffer more social injustice than the vast majority of the population. However, what we're also going to tell you is that that's kind of acceptable so long as the total amount of social justice in that state is better. Essentially, this is my claim. If we follow through with their analysis, if the Kurds could overthrow the Turkish government and make their lives better off, at the same time necessarily imposing the same level of injustice on the majority of Turkish people, they would defend that as not only a legitimate outcome, but principally legitimate from the outset. That's their defense, that's their proposition. We're not willing to accept that. Okay, so this takes place in a couple of contexts. In the first place, like in a democracy, where in theory, according to closing government, like you can use these structures, they sometimes exist, but maybe they don't. Broadly speaking, a country like the United States, where black people suffer massive social injustice versus the white majority. We think that's very similar context to when you look at the dictatorship where the majority imposes on a minority. Because essentially, according to their analysis, in both of those circumstances, the majority, either through the vote or through inaction, have acquiesced to the demands of the state to take away from the minority, to give social justice in the form of resources, in the form of extra rights to the majority. Final context is Syria. What I'm going to be telling you is that in all of these contexts, violence is neither legitimate on a principle level for much of Christian opening opposition's analysis, but it just doesn't work. It doesn't maximize social justice. It doesn't achieve the end of this debate. No thank you. So what we first need to ask is who uses violence? Who has the most incentive to use violence are the people who are most oppressed. Like, we concede that they were right on that level, okay? What that means is they're not the only people who suffer social injustice. The problem is, each of us is only capable of adjudicating on how much social injustice I feel. Because I can't realistically empathize with someone who I have nothing in common with, because I live in Aleppo and I'm not a Kurd, but I'm a Sunni in Syria, we don't think that you're going to be able to say, well, he suffers more social injustice, therefore it's not legitimate for me to use violence. Ultimately, what this means is we do indeed legitimize violence for any person who feels sufficiently injustified by their state. Their refusal to give us a definition of what social injustice means, their refusal to tell us what they think the limit of when we are suffering enough injustice in order to use violence undermines their case. Because what it means is you leave this up to each group of society. And because social injustice is distributed across everyone, even Alawites in Syria have to pay tax. On some level, that's a social injustice. We don't think they're going to be using violence, but the point is, all groups on some level don't get the absolute maximum justice they conceivably could. So we do indeed legitimize violence for anyone. Most damagingly though, the only people who can enact violence meaningfully, according to Valerie's analysis, are the people who have the direct capacity to do so. The people for whom enacting violence comes at the lowest costs personally. Who is that? Those are the people who have the capacity in terms of weapons and training. What this means is it's not the majority of Kurds in Turkey who are going to be able to fight for justice. What it is, it's the most extremists in the RPK. What it means is that not only are the extremists in the RPK undermined, not only are they sort of demonized by the international community, like opening opposition told us, but the very people they're concerned about, which is the majority of the Kurdish minority, are the people who suffer the most loss for two reasons. First of all, the state reprisals, which aren't going to necessarily be directed at the people who are actually carrying guns. We don't think that states who have a direct incentive to oppress minorities have ever been too concerned about killing the right Kurd, or too concerned about killing the right Jew. This was never a problem for any dictatorship in the past. We don't think it's going to be a problem for dictatorships in the future. In a moment, Valerie. More than this, we would say when we look at government's analysis, which was heavily sort of like extended by closing government, that any person any person who through their action or inaction allows social injustice to exist, is on some level responsible, and is on some level a legitimate target, means that any person, even if they are a member of the same minority being oppressed, who isn't willing to take up violence, is a legitimate target under their analysis. So not only do we legitimize violence against the state, not only do we legitimize violence against any member of the majority, we legitimize violence against any person who isn't willing to escalate to the degree Valerie would force them to do so.
Now that your new extension is clear, why do you want to arbitrate between who receives justice and injustice based on numbers?
Because it's called democracy. We think assuming that we are all equal moral agents, we would give more things to more people than we would give more things to the most violent minority. There we go. As for our extension being clear, it's a whip. My speech exists for a reason. Let's now finally look at the majority of Chris's analysis of, does this actually work? So we would say, first of all, the average Sunni citizen of Aleppo has more social injustice enacted against them when FSA missiles and Syrian military forces are also bombing their town all at the same time. So in the short term, in the most extreme situations, we don't decrease injustice, in fact we increase it. More than this, Chris gives us all of this analysis about how it's fundamentally impossible to predicate a just society, this kind of society they want to live in, with unjust mechanisms. We would say that, for example, in South Africa, the incredible ease with which most citizens are willing to use violence, whether they be trade unions or simple citizens of the public, to get their demands met, is a reflection of the fact that the ANC was forced to use violence means in order to predicate an allegedly just society. We normalize violence as a mechanism of addressing those things which we believe to be unacceptable as an individual. So all of Chris's analysis about how we undermine the capacity to create meaningful institutions in the future still stands, still wins the debate. I'm allowed to say this, Valerie, because I'm a web speaker. But more than this, we would say that even if we are talking about countries like India or the United States, by allowing certain people to use violence and allowing it to be seen as effective, means that you necessarily undermine all the viable alternatives that do exist in the vast majority of states. That's incredibly damaging. That means that there's less justice for all people throughout society. For that reason, I'm very proud to oppose.